Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the classical age of China. We're going to be paying special attention to these three dynasties, the Zhou, Qin, and Han. Now we're going to get started with the Zhou dynasty. They took power after the Shang fell. And this had been a long time coming. The Shang had been losing power for a little over a century before the Zhou finally took over. See, when one dynasty ends and another takes its place, especially in China, you've got a real big problem. Because first, you need to cement yourself as you deserve to rule, as opposed to everyone else. Remember, these are dynasties, so this is one family vying for control of all of China. And one of the best ways that a dynasty can take charge is to make sure that there are no surviving members of the previous dynasty in order to challenge your reign, challenge your authority. So the first thing the Shang did was the Zhou did was they murdered all the surviving Shang members. Pretty brutal stuff. And this was a really normal thing to do, and it made a lot of sense for the Zhou. But the average Chinese people, they thought that, whoa, we look at who just took power. These guys are bloodthirsty and crazy. We can't have them running the show. So the Zhou come up with this system called the Mandate of Heaven. That's the icon in the left-hand side of the screen. The concept of the Mandate of Heaven is pretty simple. The Zhou said, hey, if that Shang ruler everyone liked so much was so good, then why didn't the heavens, the divine, the celestial beings of all creation, why didn't any of them get involved to save his life? Why didn't any of them get involved to stop the Zhou? And when the rest of China can't come up with a good answer why this didn't happen, the Zhou used this to cement their rule, saying, well, if heaven wasn't going to back him, clearly we were supposed to rule. Now this may seem like a pretty flimsy precedent, but every single time we see a dynasty fall in China, the Mandate of Heaven is used to justify that transition. It helped that the new Zhou ruler, Wu Zhou, passed power and land on to all the people who were loyal to him, and this established a feudal system. Specifically, the system is called feudalism, and we'll go into a little more detail on that when we get to the Dark Ages of Europe. The Chinese feudal society was divided pretty regularly. Now, this looks similar to the caste system of India. The difference is that unless you're in those top two castes, you are pretty able to move around. At the very top, you have the king. He is the one in charge. He controls all the land in China, and he can give land to nobles in exchange for loyalty. Now, by and large, he does control the land, but the authority of the state comes from those nobles because they control the armies, they control the forces that make kings. Beneath the nobles, you've got the peasants, and there's a reason this is the big block. The peasant class was the majority of all Chinese. We're talking 85 to 90% of all Chinese found themselves in the peasant class. They would work for the noble in exchange for some mean or another. This might mean they were farmers, they were artisans, but at the very bottom of Chinese society, and this was true for a long time, was the merchant, somebody who buys and sells things. Now, this is a surprise to us in the West because merchants are held in usually a pretty decent regard. If you're good at making money by buying and selling, you're referred to as an entrepreneur. And if you're a business creator, you can find yourself making billions of dollars. But in China at this time, it was believed that merchants were the lowest of the low. In some cases, they were lower than slaves. The thing that made merchants viewed like this is because Chinese at this time believed that anyone could do this job, that they required no skill whatsoever, and if no skill is involved, then no respect is earned. We do see some interesting developments in the Zhou period when it comes to technology. We see better use of iron as well as cast iron. That's going to be a much stronger type of iron we're ever going to see. We see the development of the crossbow as well as a repeater crossbow and the continued use of silk. It's something that everybody wants, everyone's interested in, and China is keeping the origins of what is silk as well as how to make it a closely guarded state secret. During this time, if you were found sharing the secret or how silk is made, the punishment was death, and it was usually pretty brutal, and it sometimes included your family too. Now, around the 6th century, the Zhou dynasty starts to fall apart. Now, in dynastic cycles, this is where we would see another dynasty step in, take over, and rule things. The problem is we don't see one single family, one single dynastic group come into power. And China as a whole fragments, and it looks a lot like this. There are these different groups that are vying for power. They are fighting amongst themselves. No one is uniting. And this 400-year period is known as the Warring States period. This was a time where even though there was states in China, there was no Chinese nation. Over time, we're going to slowly start to see emerging ideas. Very popular Chinese philosophies are going to start to emerge. They are Confucianism and Taoism. Now, Taoism can be written with a D or a T. Sometimes it's even pronounced as Daoism, but we'll just call it Taoism and Confucianism for today. Confucianism is based on the teachings of a man named Confucius, or Master Kung, who he was known as. He believed that the world was this big, crazy, confusing place, and only through order, only through understanding how everything went, could you bring order back to the universe. He believed heavily in filial piety. This is your respect, your willingness to obey your elders, your family members. He said that everybody had a station in society, and it was that person's purpose to follow that station and do that as well as possible. When Confucius died, he didn't actually leave a written record of anything. Instead, his students wrote the Analects for him, and these became the guiding principles for the philosophy Confucianism, finding order in the universe. Some of the major things that we see in Confucianism is also that people are good, that people generally are good. They just need a good leader to show them the way. It helps if you're polite. It really helps if you're educated. Now, we must stress this is not a religion. This is a philosophy. And in China, we see a religious characteristic of ancestor worship is kind of tied to Confucianism. Even in the West, when European scholars first heard of Confucianism, it made sense. They liked the idea of an order in the world, and this comes from a printing house in London, looks like, according to that date, somewhere in the mid-19th century, and it was the idea of a philosopher king, somebody who would rule justly through knowledge and action, not necessarily through brutality and force. The second major Chinese philosophy is Taoism. I told you, written with a T. Major thing we see with Taoism is it was founded by a guy named Lao Tzu, and Lao Tzu believed that life is crazy and confusing, just like Confucius. But unlike Confucius, Lao Tzu said, you just got to go with it. You got to find harmony. You got to find balance in the world. If you meet chaos with chaos, you're just going to create even more chaos. That symbol on the right represents this philosophy more than any other. It is the symbol of yin and yang, light and darkness, in balance, in harmony. These two things can exist and do exist, but when it's in balance, everything's fine. The Warring States period is going to come to an end around 221 B.C. That's when we see the rise of the Qin Dynasty. This is started by a man named Qin Shihuangdi. He takes his small province and he unites all of China. This is somebody who got started early. He was crowned king of his state, king of his reign at the age of 13, and he just kept conquering and expanding from then on. After all of China was united, he dubs himself emperor of this new land. And from this point forward, we're going to see China, the ruler of China is called a emperor, no longer is it a king, and China is actually going to get its name from Qin. It's a simple mistranslation that Westerners did to give us the name that we now call it, China. Now, Shihuangdi made some really interesting accomplishments in his time. He made these standardized weights for measuring, for coining, and this gave a consistency to anyone who wanted to buy and sell anything. Now, that was good in China, but it was also good outside of China because everyone wants the thing that China has. The only thing China has that nobody else has at this point, silk. We see that the Chinese language system is going to start to look more like modern Mandarin. We're going to step away from the pictographic symbols and we're never coming back to them. And the Great Wall will begin to be constructed. A lot of the main parts of the wall are going to start up. Now, for Shihuangdi, it wasn't just Shihuangdi who believed this. It was a lot of modern Chinese. But they believed that the biggest threat China faced was not from among these different warring states or warring factions. They believed the much bigger, more credible threat came from outsiders. Specifically, these were the nomadic horsemen and barbarians to the north, what is now Mongolia. And boy howdy, the Chinese were right to fear the Mongols. But we'll get to that when we get to the Yuan and Song dynasties. This was a really taxing labor to build this wall. It took decades to do in just the Qin dynasty, and it would be continued to be built through the next 4 dynasties. It was expected you would build this thing because, well, look to Confucianism. You're part of the state, this is the role of the state, so you're going to build this thing. People died building this thing. I mean, you can look at how great, big, and amazing and long this thing is. Now, there's a rumor that there are bodies buried underneath it. Yeah, there's probably a body here or there, but it's not like if you walk the wall, you're going to find some guy's arm sticking out of it. The Warring States period is going to come to an end around 221 B.C. The Zhou dynasty. They took power after the Shang fell, and this had been a long time coming. The Shang had been losing power for a little over a century before the Zhou finally took over. See, when one dynasty ends and another takes its place, especially in China, you've got a real big problem. Because first, you need to cement yourself as you deserve to rule, as opposed to everyone else. Remember, these are dynasties, so this is one family vying for control of all of China. And one of the best ways that a dynasty can take charge is to make sure that there are no surviving members of the previous dynasty in order to challenge your reign, challenge your authority. So the first thing the Shang did was the Zhou did was they murdered all the surviving Shang members. Pretty brutal. The thing about Shihuangdi's death, we have a lot of holes in it. We know for a fact he died in 210 BC. However, how he died is really up for questions. Some people say he was murdered, some say he died of old age, some people say that he committed suicide. The last about decade of his life he spent trying to become immortal, and in the end, nothing worked. The legend of Shihuangdi was so great that when he died, he ordered this well, actually it was before he died, but while he was nearing death, he ordered this massive terracotta army to stand guard at his tomb. And when he was buried, and when the army kind of was buried and hushed away, people thought it was just this great, amazing myth about this guy that, he was great and wonderful and terrible and frightening and horrible at the same time. Right up until we found the army. We didn't find it until the late 20th century when it was totally unearthed. Now, Shihuangdi's dynasty will not live much farther than he does. Shihuangdi stays in power because people were terrified of him. When his son takes over, people realize, you're not the big scary man that your dad was. And the son only rules for a few years before he is killed, ousted from power, and then the Han Dynasty takes over. When we talk about the Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, we talk about the real golden age of China. Everything harsh and brutal that Shi Huangdi did is now very, very quickly going away. Liu Bang was infamous for lowering taxes and making a lot of those punishments not include the phrase death, which was really popular. Probably one of the single greatest rulers that we see in the Han Dynasty is Wudi. He is going to expand the borders of the empire itself, and he starts a whole lot of trade concepts across the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road was a series of these different trade routes, which is going to link China and the Mediterranean. These are two different parts of Eurasia that could trade back and forth. And once the European side starts seeing what the Asian side has to offer, everyone gets real interested in China. Now, roads, we'll talk about them a little more in a minute. During the Han Dynasty, they also start instituting the civil service exam. This is a government test. Anyone can take it, and by anyone I do mean boys. You could come from any family to take this test. It helps if you come from a rich, powerful family, but anyone legally could take it. And if you pass the test, you get a good government job. It didn't matter what your parents did. It didn't matter how much money you had in the bank. It didn't matter how smart you are. It matters if you can pass this test. Now, don't think this test was an easy cakewalk. It really wasn't. Usually the first step of taking the test is they lock you in a room with the essay to write, and then they give you food and water and a bucket. And the bucket is for when you're done with the food and the water. And you have to stay in there until you're done. This can take you hours, this can take you days. But in the end, the most qualified person got the job. And this was really what China needed to continue to grow. And this is going to establish a real good trend. Now, if this sounds familiar, you're going to see some of the same stuff about Han-era China with the Roman Empire. In fact, this was a major DBQ a few years ago. There's the Silk Road stuff. It's not just stuff that's moving, it's also cultures. Cultures are moving, ideas are being spread all along this pathway. It's not just one road, it's a collection of... The thing about Shi Huangdi's death, we have a lot of holes in it. We know for a fact he died in 210 B.C. Eventually, the Han Dynasty starts to fall apart. Now, after Wudi passes away, the Han Dynasty is going to continue to live on for quite some time. But, well, over the period of 400 years, the dynasty just gets more and more weak. Eventually, we're going to see Hunnic forces are going to overthrow the Han Dynasty. These are not the same Huns that are going to bother the Germans, but they're in the same family of barbaric groups. Confucianism is based on the teachings of a man named Confucius, or Master Kung, who he was known as. He believed that the world was this big, crazy, confusing place, And only through order, only through understanding how everything went, could you bring order back to the universe. He believed heavily in filial piety. This is your respect, your willingness to obey your elders, your family members. He said that everybody had a station in society, and it was that person's purpose to follow that station and do that as well as possible. When Confucius died, he didn't actually leave a written record of anything. Instead, his students wrote the Analects for him, and these became the guiding principles for the philosophy Confucianism, finding order in the universe.